Good morning. I'm Lisa Abbott, Executive Vice President of Economic and Community Development for Regional Opportunity Initiatives, and I would like to welcome you to the second of our six-part housing webinar series based on the Indiana Uplands Regional Housing Study. We're really excited to have you join us this morning to talk about medium density and infill housing development and adaptive reuse. If you were unable to join us last week, we did two polls during the presentation, so today I'm going to go over them. We will do an additional poll between our sessions today about adaptive reuse. So last week, we asked you to identify your biggest housing challenges, and 56% of you said that it was single-family housing, and 19% said it was financing and deal development. If you missed last week's session on single-family housing development, you can find the recording on our website. If you're interested in financing and deal development, stay tuned. We have an upcoming session on project financing. Our second poll asked about whether or not you've read and used the housing study. 42% of you have read it, and half of those respondents said that they have used it. In our post-session survey, we had one person ask about funding sources. Throughout the series, the presenters will touch on funding opportunities along with our session on project financing. Another respondent asked about finding a developer like Jane Hendrickson. Well, last week we provided you with her contact information, and you can check her out on her website for her company, Boxer Girl LLC. We had another couple of comments that might turn into future sessions, so please share with us where you think there is something we should explore further. So last week, ROI President and CEO Tina Peterson gave a brief overview of the housing study, but we didn't have time to talk about Section 3. Section 3 outlines ideas for a path forward for the Indiana Uplands to help increase housing variety and affordability. Many of these sessions are based on solutions found in that section. I think the last sentence really outlines our goals here. Actions must be strategic to generate a positive shift in the housing market necessary to better serve the populations of the Indiana Uplands for generations to come. And we hope that these sessions will help you determine those actions. Today, we're going to talk about smaller developments and adaptive reuse. These can be used to provide housing for the market described here, retirees, seniors, and young professionals. I think that you're going to find our speakers very interesting. The housing study has a lot of data about what's needed in the Indiana Uplands. The National Association of Realtors has complementary data to what we found during our study. Their survey found that 1 in 5 respondents across the country preferred to live in an attached home in a walkable community. Walkability increased their quality of life. And more than 70% of the residents say walkability, a short commute, and proximity to highways were important in deciding where to live. And it's generational. More millennials prefer walking to driving. Today, many of these examples you're going to see to create a more walkable lifestyle for people in our region. So we would like to invite you to enjoy our upcoming sessions and to get registered for our annual report to the region scheduled for October 13th. You'll find a lot of really interesting information in the upcoming sessions, and we are really looking forward to discussing the things that we have been doing during our annual meeting. So now I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is going to be Julie Collier. She is the Vice President of Development with Flaherty and Collins. She is a Ball State graduate, and she has an her expertise is in historic preservation. She's the mother of 2 and 1 on the way, and she enjoys outdoors, particularly hiking and running and snow skiing. And she enjoys spending time with her family and friends. And we're really looking forward to hearing what she's been up to with adaptive reuse and historic preservation. Our second speaker is Mike Sudol. His first career focused on business and technology consulting, with 20 years revolving around the mobility and wireless industry. His career started in Washington, D.C., and then he moved on to a number of really interesting places all throughout the world. He is married, and his wife, Denise, they live in Spencer, Indiana. They have 4 grown children. They're actively involved in the Spencer community, and his wife is the owner and operator of Dragonfly Gallery. And he's been very active. He calls himself a reluctant developer. So he's been very active in Spencer, and I think you're going to learn a lot of really interesting things about what these two have been doing in the area. Julie?
Thanks for the introduction, Lisa. Hi, everybody. My name's Julie Collier. I'm a developer at Flaherty and Collins. I've been with the company for about 8 years. I have master's degrees in historic preservation and urban planning from Ball State. And I had a life prior to development in business and marketing, mostly in the real estate brokerage world, from Washington, D.C. to Seattle. So I came back about 10 years ago for grad school, interned at Flaherty and Collins, and have been here ever since. Flaherty and Collins was founded in 1993 by David Flaherty and Jerry Collins. They're both still very active with the company. We employ about 450 employees, a little bit more than that, throughout the United States. And we're a full service real estate company. So we're development, construction, and property management. And a bulk of our employment is in that property management sector. We manage about 15,000 units, give or take, right around 100 properties at a time. And over 350 of those employees are on-site employees at those properties. So today, I think I'll go over, kind of how I look at adaptive reuse in communities throughout Indiana. We've done quite a bit of housing adaptive reuse throughout the state and surrounding states. And I think there's definitely a formula you have to look at, because if you're looking at adaptive reuse, historic preservation, and trying to reuse buildings for a new use, there's definitely a lot of planning that has to go into it. So I'll walk you through some of those points and then project examples. Building a successful project, I think most importantly, you've got to have the right team on board, from architects, contractors, consultants, the right engineers. You've got to have the right people who are willing to communicate and work through it, because it's not an easy process. I like that Mike called himself a reluctant developer, because it's not an easy thing to do. I don't think any development is easy. I think adaptive reuse and historic preservation are particularly difficult, but I think they're incredibly rewarding fields of development to work in. So funding your project, which this session isn't really about, but it goes hand in hand with how you adaptively reuse existing buildings for housing. What are your eligible sources? A lot of how we finance projects, we're a multifamily housing developer. Typically, a lot of infill mixed use goes with that, but multifamily is our bread and butter. So we're funding projects mostly with the rental housing tax credits or the low-income housing tax credits through the Indiana Housing Community Development Authority, and coupling those with historic tax credits, other local funds, soft funding through IHCDA. But a lot of those funding sources are available for housing only, and not necessarily, some of them, not necessarily other uses. And then understanding historic eligibility. If you're going to be reusing historic resources, just because a building is old does not mean it's eligible for historic tax credits. And so if you don't have a good grasp of that, having someone who does on your team is really helpful. And there's also a great resource in the State Historic Preservation Office in determining eligibility for buildings. I'll talk about a couple of the projects past and present that we've worked on. They're all housing. All of them have involved the low-income housing tax credit as a part of the financing. So the first is the retreat at Mineral Springs in Martinsville, Indiana. This rehabbed 3 historic resources close to the downtown center. It's 38 affordable apartments targeted at seniors, 55 plus. All within walking distance to the downtown square. And we developed this in partnership with the Community Service Center of Morgan County. So we actually got down there because we answered an RFP for an old sheriff's residence and jail. And we were awarded that RFP, but it wasn't quite big enough to make a whole project. So we asked the city, what other historic resources do you have that you'd like to see fixed up? And this building right here, the old Kennedy home, or the Martinsville Sanitarium, which was a Wellspring building, came up. And then a Kivitz Five and Dime store, historic store on the square, came up. So this building is just 1/5 of what the original building was when it was built in 1925. The back of it had been ripped off at one point, and the building had been used pretty well through the early 90s, and then that use ended. So when we got the building, it hadn't been in use in about 20 years. So there were a lot of failing systems. It was a big challenge. So on the left, you can see what the building looked like when we got it. A lot of plaster melting off the walls, and on the floor above this, there was actually a good moss garden growing in one of the rooms. So this is what the building looked like when we got involved in the project. By the time we were actually able to start construction, because of all of the funding sources that go into it and timing to get the project together, this floor had actually completely collapsed. So on the right, you see the after of what it was. Again, a lot of planning by a lot of people to make the project what it was at the end, but it ended up really great. And this is the Morgan County Sheriff's Residence and Jail, which was also a part of the project. Historic tax credit projects are very nuanced. There are a lot of rules you have to follow in adaptively reusing these resources. And so here, because this was a former jail, there were cells in the back part of the building, which you can see kind of on the right side of this picture, and we actually had to leave those in place. It was actually a two-story single steel structure. So the construction team thanked us because they weren't sure, aside from taking down all the bricks, removing the cells, and then rebuilding the back portion of the building, they weren't sure how they were going to get those cells out of there. But anyway, makes for an interesting project. So you can see the back part prior to rehab, where the cells were located, and the cells themselves before rehab. So those still exist today. There are 4 units in that building. And if residents want to see the jail cells and visit, they are welcome to do that if they can ask property management. Don't worry, we don't keep anyone in there if they're bad boys or girls. So next slide, Maren. Next project, historic Greensburg Square in Greensburg, Indiana. This is 40 affordable apartments, again, financed with the rental housing tax credit through IHCDA. This was built in partnership with Housing Partnerships, Inc. So again, I think building good local partnerships is important to helping these projects get off the ground. This project, again, involved 3 historic buildings. So these are the other 2. The building on the left is the old Sites Hotel and the Poker Hall. A tornado in 2011 had ripped the roof off of the Sites Hotel, and so it was deteriorating fairly quickly by the time we got our hands on it in 2013. It was in need of a lot of repairs. So, and then the other building is another building that was behind the YMCA that was in pretty bad shape. The city had a big interest in rehabbing. So a local man had actually gotten control of these buildings and was trying to figure out how to make them all work. And so that's how we got involved through Housing Partnerships, Inc. to come in and help raise the funds to make sure that there was enough money to get these projects built appropriately. So this is a good before and after of the YMCA building, the first building on this project that we saw. It was built in 1926. So there was actually a lot of really good historic character left in there. It was a fun one to work on and save some of that stuff. So this is the community room in that building. You can see the original limestone fireplace, and some of the original woodwork was left with bookshelves. Historic Sullivan Lofts. This was a half and half historic rehab, and then we had, of the 40 units total, 20 of the units were in historic buildings around the square, so very walkable. And then 20 of the units were actually new construction, single family homes throughout Sullivan. And so the impact reached further than just the downtown square. This one was developed in partnership with Vision Communities, a nonprofit whose mission is housing. And the city and Mayor Lamb were very, very involved in this project. Again, a lot of planning up front with the local municipality, construction, architect, architect here was Mizek and Palmer, and historic consultants and engineers to make sure that we had all the resources we needed to get this project done. So this is the other part of the historic rehab, which took almost one whole side of the downtown square. And while these facades look complete, there were very many interesting things happening behind them. So there was a building that had a large skylight in it that we had to retain for the historic tax credits. And then this courtyard. So a building had almost just been demolished in between everything, but the facade still stood. So due to the historic tax credits and the project that was a part of the financing, we had to figure out how to save some of these character defining features. Again, adaptive reuse is nuanced. It takes a lot of thought and planning to make sure that you're following your historic tax credit guidelines, Secretary of Interior standards, and that you'll be able to get certified at the end of the project. Music City Place in Richmond, Indiana, 50 affordable units aimed at seniors. This is an old YMCA. The portion on the right was built in the 20s. The portion on the left was built in the 50s. All functionally relatable from a historic tax credit standpoint. So it was an interesting process working with the historic consultant with the two separate decades of styles that we kind of had to keep in line with to use the historic tax credits on the project. Again, this was financed using low-income housing tax credits through IHCDA, soft funding through the city and the state agency, again, and historic tax credits. So the building was the site on this one. There was quite a bit going on with, this is right at US 40 and US 27. So we even had to work with and team up with NDOT on certain portions of this project. And this was a large gym space in the 50s edition. And so there were two gym spaces in there. There was one in the original building and one in the new building. So for historic tax credits, you kind of have to work with your consultant in the state to see which historic resources are going to be most important to keep. And here we were able to put units in this large volume space, which they typically don't like to see, but we kept the other space open, so it was a good trade-off. We didn't close it all in. We actually kept a cool atrium space that ended up being a community gathering area for the residents. So you can still see a portion of the volume of the area in the original wall on the right-hand side and the first picture on the left. And then there are units in the picture on the left to the left of the community area. So adaptive reuse certainly creates very creative spaces and interesting spaces to live in for housing. It's one of the biggest upsides, I think, is being able to have unique living areas. And then this is the historic lobby in the older section of the building. We had to clean up the original tile, and there was a lot of plaster work that went into ensuring that we followed all the historic tax credit rules and guidelines. Current projects, this is a building in Terre Haute. It was built as the Miller Parrott Bakery building, which made saltine crackers, built around 1926. When we got involved in the project, the Lighthouse Mission had been in this building, but the back of it had burned off a couple years prior to us taking it. So this was about 100,000 square foot facility, quite a beast. Took a lot of planning up front with historic consultants, particularly with the general contractor we hired to build this one. And it's ongoing. It's set to be done in November of this year. So these are some before pictures. You can see on the right-hand side pictures where the back of the building burned off or was actually demolished after it burned. And it was in pretty bad shape, but there was definitely enough building left over to get 54 units aimed at seniors into the building, again, financed with low-income housing tax credits, historic tax credits, various soft funding sources through IHCDA. and some local funds as well. So I don't have any afters, but you can see some of the things that we were dealing with prior to starting construction, and kind of how the building had changed from when it was built in 1924, circa 1924, to when we got it. And you know, a lot of these drop ceilings have to come out, and building or windows have to be revealed. Again, all things we have to do for the historic tax credit guidelines. And again, this is the last one, 64, actually it's 68 units. We have 4 market rate units in this development, 64 affordable units. Again, financed with the tax credits through IHCDA, historic tax credits, soft funding. And this is just west of Terre Haute in St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. This project is in partnership with the Sisters of Providence. We just started construction on this one. We'll be done at the end of next year. And this building was originally built as the Sisters Novitiate, and most recently was their administration building, but it was more space than they needed. So we are helping them turn it into senior housing. Again, historic tax credits. It's a beautiful campus. If you guys haven't been out there, it's definitely worth a visit. They've got a great organic farm and farm stand, alpacas, horses. It's very idyllic and a great spot. So infill in the sense that it's part of a campus that's been around since the early 1800s, but this is definitely outside of an urban center. So I think that's the last thing I've got. I think the biggest thing for adaptive reuse development is, again, having a good team in place to make sure that you've got the resources and the expertise to execute on the projects once you have them teed up, and then local partnerships to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and you as the developer are getting what you need from the local municipality to get these projects done. They're definitely a challenge, but they're rewarding when they're done.
Thank you, Julie. I do have a question for you. We're going to get ready to do our poll today. But while we're doing our poll, Julie, I'd like you to, when I look at these pictures, there's so much work. I mean, you know, when you show the before pictures, I just can't even imagine going in and trying to turn them into the beautiful spaces that you showed us afterwards. So tell me a little bit about why you select those buildings and how this kind of development is really beneficial to communities.
Yeah, really, we're not selecting anything. We're being called into the communities to help fix up the resources. And so 100% of our development work is really public-private partnership, and I would put these in that category where, you know, all these resources were identified by local sources as needing to be saved. And one way or another, Flaherty and Collins was brought into it based on our expertise and experience in rehabbing these types of resources.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so next up is going to be Mike, and he's going to talk to us about some infill development, and then we'll do questions at the end.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me and Julie talk a little bit about development in small towns. Starting with Julie, coming from what I would say is a big company with a lot of scale and resources to pull projects together and execute them and create really compelling projects and housing opportunities and communities throughout Indiana. It's one of the things that excited me when I first started to get involved with Spencer, is this notion that there were these unused and underutilized spaces that, if they had the right attention, that they could be turned around into something useful for the community. And then along the way, for me, as Julie mentioned, this accidental or reluctant developer role that I've taken over the last 10 years. Just with what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the Trillium Woods and the evolution and that we've gone on over that period, and a little bit specifically around the role that I've taken and my wife and I have taken in Spencer, and share some of our projects and some of our thoughts as a developer in a small community. And for those that don't know Spencer is about 2,000 people population, and 20,000 plus for the county, Owen County. When I came to town in 2010, I had no thought other than just kind of retiring from my mobile technology career, where I had kind of traveled back and forth across the Pacific. In 15 years, I probably flew about 3 million miles, if you can believe that. So I decided that I knew I wanted to do something different, had moved back from Beijing, China, and was really looking to have some kind of retirement income that didn't have anything to do with getting on an airplane and mobile technology. And it just happened that there was a building that came for sale, and it was outside of the town, but it was a property that had a few rental units that were in desperate need of renovation. And so I bought that property to see if I could improve it and kind of see if I wanted to do anything else beyond that, or whether it would just be too overwhelming and I'd go on to something different. And what happened is that it kind of turned into a proving point for taking a tired property and investing in it, renovating the apartments and upgrading the units, increasing the rental incomes, and it gave us a little bit of confidence when a property came available in 2012 in the town area. We just thought that this could be something that we could apply that initial learning and see if I could really do something more than that. And it really was a very incremental approach to getting involved in the town and getting involved in development. And so we started that project, went through it, and as we got involved in that in this small town, we started to meet people that had been around all along and seeing Spencer go through its decline from the 1980s when Walmart came to town and kind of gutted the downtown area. But we saw all these people that really, really wanted to see Spencer come back to life and had been involved in various projects on their own in many different ways. And that's what got us a little bit excited about being more than just involved in buying a property and renovating it and going on to the next thing. And really that's what led to us getting involved with Spencer Main Street. And my wife and I were part of that initial founding of the Main Street organization under Okra. It really provided a lot of guidance for putting some framework around how a town comes back to life. And we started to be involved in that thread. And as we started to be involved in that thread, that led to continued involvement in the downtown area. And it happened that another building came on the market when our daughter was getting ready for college, and that led us to really getting into the next renovation project. I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail later. That became the Dragonfly Gallery over a 1 to 2 year phased implementation of the renovation of another older building. And that led us to buying some other buildings on the south side of the square. And so this very, very happenstance sort of journey really revolved around the courthouse square and taking some of these tired properties and figuring out how to bring life to them, and really involved in some rolling up our sleeves in a very practical way of getting these types of projects done in an economic way, but also in a very staged and serial, purposeful way. And while we were doing that as part of Spencer Main Street, we've always had the data that kind of suggested that the housing stock in Spencer was tired, and the market was woefully underserved with respect to new housing, apartment rentals, and that there was nobody paying attention to it. And this problem, especially with housing, was always there in this, in this time frame of the last half dozen years. And I was always hoping that somebody would come along and realize that Spencer's coming back to life. Now's the time we'll start to build houses in and around the downtown area. And it just didn't happen. And so that was kind of what led to us getting involved and saying, well, let's kickstart this as well if we can. Let's prove to people that it's worth it to build new houses in a downtown area where they haven't had new houses built in a meaningful way in a generation. So that kind of led us in 2017 to kind of jumpstart the residential part of what we do at Trillium Woods, and then kind of just go from one project to the next, and hope that along the way, while actively involved in Spencer Main Street, while passively involved in different types of initiatives like ROI, to have all the pieces kind of line up so that not only would it help us as a small developer in establishing whatever success we have in our little community, but through Spencer Main Street and what we learn is to create a sounding board, which is what this conference is about, of helping other people in other small communities look at projects and opportunities and think about rolling up your sleeves, because in smaller towns, that's really what it takes, I think, to allow for this next phase of redevelopment and revitalization to happen. I mentioned Spencer. It's serendipitous that I ended up here, and not from Indiana, but found my way here, as I mentioned, in 2010, thanks to eHarmony. And at that time, who is now my wife, she was already living in Owen County, and I was trying to convince her to move to Hawaii, where I had a lot of family and friends. And she said she'd already found her paradise. And so I came to Spencer and Owen County in the woods in southern Indiana, and anybody who lives here knows how beautiful this place is. And so that is what got me here. But I didn't give any thought to Spencer, other than what I mentioned earlier, is just to have a couple of things to do. But as I started to get involved in Spencer, I've got a business background and have done a couple of startups, and I was very purposeful about whether or not Spencer was worth my time or my money. And I think we all have to do that whenever we're looking at different opportunities for, where we invest both of those. And, for me, it became really clear with respect to Spencer that the economics really were compelling, even though the returns may not be what you would ever expect in larger communities. And as long as you could rationalize that with your own economic framework, then the notion of seeing and being involved in a community like Spencer became really, really easy. We had the benefit of having both Boston Scientific and Cook Pharmaca having operations facilities in our town. For those who don't know where Spencer is, in our geographic area, where we're close enough to Bloomington to kind of be a bedroom community of Bloomington, and not far away from Indianapolis. It's only an hour commute if that's something that people really want to engage in from a rural lifestyle and have to work in an urban center. I did that commute for a little while myself, never minded it. I spent time commuting in Chicago and in Beijing and Taipei, and hour-long commutes were never a problem for me. But our proximity to Bloomington and yet still having our own unique charm makes Spencer a really, really idyllic place to live. If we solve the housing problem, then we start to kind of get that ball rolling when we think about this live, work, and play construct. With respect to Trillium Woods, I'll show a little bit more on these different projects. I mentioned earlier, starting with the first project in town, which was the old agricultural epitomist building, which we renovated, and then that led to the Dragonfly Gallery, and then that led to what we did on South Market Street, which is still ongoing, and then the residential properties that we started on subsequently. And when we started with the agricultural epitomist, 1910, when it was built, for those that don't know, the agricultural epitomist actually became Farm Life magazine in the 1920s. It had a subscriber base before the Depression of over 1 million subscribers. And just to the right of this building is actually the printing press building that was built in 1925. We actually own that as well. But our first building was this one, and you can see it as it was starting to be renovated with the old windows on the second and first floor. And we put in new windows and kind of wrapped around the building and improved the energy efficiency by putting in all the new doors and windows, putting in new HVAC, and then going on the inside and going and doing a very purposeful renovation, apartment by apartment. But looking at this idea of creating loft style apartments in downtown Spencer to serve the local needs of Spencer. With Boston and Cook here, with lots of people making $15 an hour, we weren't looking to make a lot of money on a 1 and 2 bedroom apartment, but we felt like the economics made it compelling for us to roll up our sleeves and get this project done. Just kind of a little bit of showing some, not quite before, but during the renovation process when we gutted all of the spaces, and then the whole idea of less loft style apartments were on the 3rd floor. There are 9 to 10 foot ceilings that we tried to keep as close to this the original aluminum ceiling as possible, but not being able to keep it exposed just because we had to run all of our modern HVAC equipment up above the drop ceiling that we created in there. But we still created these unique spaces that everybody's surprised to see would be in a small town. And I think there's a lot of people that have seen that over the last several years in these wonderful old buildings that have so much character, where you just have a lot of ability and flexibility to take these beautiful big spaces and repurpose them and revitalize them and hopefully add another 50 years of meaningful life to these spaces. And that's what we've been able to do on the second floor. We've got these 11 or 12 foot ceilings that we've been able to take advantage of, even and still hide the mechanicals above. And so that's what we did over here when we put in our new HVAC systems. Everything's above. We couldn't preserve any of the old ceilings. Those had already been destroyed from the prior renovations that had happened before we got there. But we tried to create a lot of character and charm with the space that we had. And that was really the first project for us in downtown Spencer, where we went through this over a couple of phases in a year and a half of working on the 3rd floor first, where we had to replace half of the roof and then secure the insides. And then we went down to the 2nd floor and kind of did our renovations there. So we've got 5 units there. We never have any problem renting them. And that led us to, while we were doing this renovation, the next building. And as we were getting involved with Spencer Main Street, and my wife and I were coming to town and being involved in these meetings, there was a sign on the window of the building on the left. It's really 2 buildings. It was originally built as one building for the Oddfellows Club, back in the 1880s, and had been divided over time so that there's a building on the left side where the 2 windows are on the upstairs, and then on the right side where the 3 windows are, which is really the building that was the Dragonfly Gallery that was being used, but very, very inefficiently on the 1st floor, and hadn't been used upstairs in in probably 50 years. And so when my wife saw the building, she said, I know what I want to put in this building. And it became her baby. And we spent a year and a half going through renovations in 2 phases, getting the first floor completely renovated, gutting the second floor so we could open the shop on the first floor after a year, and then we could continue with the renovations on the second floor without disturbing the retail space down below. And so that's kind of how we phased in this next project. And it was really trying to create a destination shopping experience that resonates with this authenticity of local small town, and you can't replicate it in a shopping environment. You can't replicate it online. And so the whole notion of what unique value propositions small towns have to offer become unique to those small towns. And for us, we have the ability to take this old space that had 14-foot ceilings on the first floor and 18-foot ceilings on the second floor and create this really, really neat shopping destination that serves as just one of the many anchor points during Spencer's revitalization. And we just allowed ourselves to be part of that journey and opening the doors for involvement with the community, involvement with other people as they started to have their ideas of building and starting businesses, and whether we could help them or just be part of the overall community involvement and supporting them. And that's part of the Spencer Main Street and the Main Street initiative, where while this Dragonfly was being opened up, the Tivoli still was brand new in terms of its renovation as the 100-year-old theater that had just been opened without any real understanding of whether people would come to a small theater in Spencer to watch movies. And we just believed that when you create these foundational elements that create a unique destination, that people will start to come as a result. And built around this, with respect to Spencer Main Street, we were supporting and be involved with helping local restaurants come into the town and more shops come into the town, because it's not just about one place, but it's about all the places that get created along the journey of revitalizing a small downtown area around a courthouse. And as we were finishing up the Dragonfly, the buildings that were on the south side of the market square in the lower left-hand corner of the picture is kind of what it looked like 10 years ago. And essentially vacant buildings that had seen their life come and go from a long time ago. And up in the upper right-hand corner is kind of what it looked like 100 years ago, when there used to be the silent movie theater over the kind of the third building from the left. And there was a furniture store that had been there from its inception, almost 150 years ago, up until the time that Walmart came to town and essentially it closed down. And the building on the right had its own life, from a historical perspective. But again, everything had been sitting vacant for a number of years and had been for sale for a number of years. And nobody was stepping in to buy them, and wasn't really clear, even when I was looking at them, whether they were salvageable and whether or not they'd have to be demolished. And that's also part of that journey that I was on, is to be able to get a level of comfort with what you could save and what you couldn't save, but frame of not having unlimited resources. We had to be really pragmatic about what buildings we could actually work to save and where we'd have to do more extensive renovation. And so that kind of led us, though, from this Dragonfly to kind of, which was on Main Street, to Caddy Corner, to Market Street, and starting these projects. Unfortunately, the two-story buildings on the far left were too far gone in terms of the front facade for a small developer. So for us, what it meant is that we basically had to rebuild the front facade. We put a new framed wall behind the original wall, and then tore down the original brick wall, which had already failed in too many places for us to save. And then we rebuilt the front facade on the two-story sections and turned that into commercial space on the first floor and apartments on the second floor. And so the fun part about doing these kinds of projects, if you have architectural or construction comfort, is that you get to peel back layers and see some really, really cool architectural detail, construction detail that you can decide whether you want to keep or incorporate into a modern property. And so we were able to blend that in this project. And as I've said, even though we had to replace the entire front facade, we were able to expose sides on the, of the brick, for these apartments and commercial spaces. So they had this character from the past with a modern blend. And again, in Little Spencer, and there are lots of Little Spencers throughout Indiana that make these kinds of projects worth pursuing for people that are in their communities and willing to willing to roll up your sleeves. And what I mentioned earlier is along this way, it's still dangling in the back. We're doing these renovations, we're converting these apartments. We know that there's more need, demand for residential units of any kind. And as I mentioned earlier, that kind of got me to this stage where I was thinking still about what I want to do beyond just renovating old properties in town and turning them into commercial opportunities. There's this other itch that I had about trying to solve this problem with respect to residential housing. Not that I was going to solve it, but to kickstart it. And so that's what led us to one of the next projects, is to say, let's go and figure out how we could take some vacant property in town and see if there's a way to repurpose it and turn it into some higher value property, not just for us, but for the community. And this notion of live, work, and play, when you have all of these great things going on around the courthouse square, that you still have 2-3 blocks away properties that look like what's on the slides on the right hand side. Unfortunately, circa 1930s house that had gone through a lot of hard living, and when it got to me, I wasn't in a position where I would be looking at this as a historic renovation of a small house. I could only look at this and say, well, I can't save it, so I'm going to tear it down. I saved a few things inside the house that were interesting. But I really wanted to look at this as that really driving this new urbanism concept of, pocket projects within a small town. And so this 126 by 68 foot lot was an idea of, taking it and subdividing it into 3 lots or 4, and seeing if I could, create or kickstart this new housing problem to turn it into an opportunity. And one of the things that Spencer is blessed with is, and I mentioned earlier, community and the importance of having the community to be part of the overall story for how you get involved in any type of economic revitalization. And part of community is the town itself. And we're fortunate that Spencer has had on its town council and in different commissions a variety of people who all believed that Spencer's best days were not behind them, and they were willing to take risks, even with somebody like me, to say, yeah, we'll go ahead and help subdivide this. We talked about 3 houses or 4 houses, in a very informal conversation in the Planning and Zoning Commission, where I had a bunch of conceptual drawings, and we could talk about the density and what type of product I was considering here, and come up with a plan that, working together to say, well, let's go and do a 3-lot and see how that goes. And so going through that process, one of the good things about being in a small town is you can get through the process quickly if people are engaged and willing to be part of the change process. I did all the survey work up front. So when it was time to go and actively be in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission, within 2 meetings, we were done. And then it was only something to get in front of the town council for the Planning and Zoning Commission to recommend this change, which they did. So I was able to kind of get that project up and off the ground pretty quickly. And then that kind of led to this being the before, that I could go and build some houses in this, small space. And for me, it took about 1.5 years to get through this, where this is kind of the after. The picture on the right, where the blue house is, actually shows where the old house used to be. So the town kind of supported me creating 42-foot wide lots, and I built 26-foot wide houses. So my setbacks are a little bit more on the sides for each of the end houses, and you end up with about 15 feet or a little bit less in the middle, between the houses. So for anybody who's done infill projects, very, very manageable in terms of the overall dimensioning. It was important for me to create that look and feel of porch forward, wanting to bring out the idea of, having your neighbors be able to walk in front and talk to them. And so for me, that extended just in the design that I created to have the front porch on the ground level, but also to have a master porch up above. And yet each of these are designed so that your porches are next to your neighbors, so you can have that privacy. And if you want to engage with them, you can. You just can't do it across the porches and across the railing. So, but again, it was very much about this idea of new urbanism. I didn't create that, term and that notion, and being able to go to places like Dunn Street and be influenced by that, in Bloomington, or Renwick. And there's countless other places around the state where this concept exists, and it's easy to apply if you have a community in a town that's willing to do this. And I wanted to create a product that had a certain price point in it. I had to wait until I got that price point so I could use that appraised value of the first house to kind of set the bar and reset the bar in an area where selling a $200,000 house was something that hadn't been done. And so I had to make sure that we could get it done on the first one. And now that we've demonstrated that, it really kind of allowed us to move to the next project, which is where we are now. West Wayne Street, as I said, is one that we finished last year. And you can kind of see what I've done with the interiors, creating a high-end look and feel, but still at an affordable price point. And that's part of my strategic view of what I'm trying to do when I'm creating houses. There's lots of different ways that you can look at your individual markets to figure out what the right price point is, what the right finish levels are, that you can manage those two together. But the notion of being able to take a tired old property or a vacant property and take it down, from the tax rolls where it might be on the books at $30,000 or $50,000, and turn it into 3 new properties with people who are adding to the tax base and adding to the walkability of the community. That holistic view of this stepping stone is really what we're doing in Spencer, and we're a small enough town where we can start to do these kinds of things. And if you could demonstrate the success in one area, then you could see if you can apply the same formula. Luckily for us, a couple of blocks away, but on the east side of town, but still only a couple of blocks from the square, there were actually 2 lots that were available. And I bought them last year, and, they had, trailers on one of them, and, same kind of concept. Now when I'm in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission, I have the ability to tell a story of, yeah, we thought we might be able to do something on Wayne Street. It looks like that's actually come to fruition. I've got an opportunity to replicate that model and kind of expand it to another part of the town. And really, it's still all about and building up the interest level so that when people drive to Spencer or drive through Spencer, they look at it in a completely different way. And if it sparks that idea of doing something themselves, then to me, that's a winning proposition. If all it means is that I'm building houses, then I failed. In terms of what my mission is, for being part of the community and being part of Spencer's revitalization. So it really is still about that journey that I'm on. And with a short period of time of buying these and going through that process, to do something similar to what I did on Main Street, but having its own unique design elements. So, so that's what I'm doing. And while it looks like the Wayne Street houses, I'm creating, its own identity over here and trying to build up that story using that same model, a vacant lot or an underutilized lot that I can subdivide and make the economics work for me. And everybody has their own economics that they have to look to for what they do before they're going to get involved in any project. But when it comes to being involved at the community level, these are the things that Trillium Woods has gotten involved in. We've been on this journey of starting from the courthouse square and kind of radiating out from there. And when I look at this model, if I can use that term loosely, and kind of apply that Main Street model from Okra that they were generous enough to have, for Indiana. And for those that don't know about Main Street and the Main Street organization, I ask that you look for smaller communities to understand and get involved and maybe for bigger companies to roll up your sleeves and dig a little deeper, because the economics of getting involved in these kinds of communities may not be readily apparent, and only when you're not dealing with IHCDA resources in other types of investment vehicles. You have to look at the project on different merits and still be economically viable. If you can figure out how to do that, there is this for smaller works. And what Indiana has with respect to its Main Street organization is something that really allows for these smaller communities to have a chance of coming up with a business plan for revitalization. The design of it, the marketing element of it, and being able to tie all those things together with local community businesses. And that's a part that I think is not required for success in Indiana, but it helps. No matter what you do, the community involvement is required for success. You've got an unlimited checkbook, then you can do whatever you want. But outside of that, getting the community around you, having a town council or a mayor's office with the Planning and Zoning Commission that are supportive of the notion of how you can take a distressed property and turn it into something of higher economic value. Something that resonates without alienating. And that's always a challenge where there's a lot of people who look at what we're doing, well, I don't want you to do this. I don't want you improving the town. I don't want higher property taxes. I don't want my real estate value to go up. There are always the things that get bogged down and for why you don't change. Luckily, my career has been about being a change agent, so I'm comfortable with trying to help craft a vision around a long-term plan and being patient enough to see it through. And everybody has to decide as they get involved in this with respect to the economics of what the right return is. It's not big city returns. It may be, but the real return or the intrinsic value that you get from seeing a community come back to life. And if you're willing to be involved in that sort of way and don't have a problem with rolling up your sleeves, then you get to really see this whole process play itself out over 5 years and over 10 years. And I'll leave it at that. But the one thing that got me started on Sensory, if you can believe it, is my experience in Beijing. And I was enough in graduate school as part of my international studies to go to China. And in 1993, China was not the China of today. It was a newly developing China, whether it's in southern China, in Shenzhen and Guangdong, or in the Shanghai area, or in Beijing, which was still a communist country. All big change from 1993 until when I left in 2010, having lived in China a couple of different times along the way. And I looked at all of this massive change that they were able to orchestrate in these big cities. And I came to Spencer and I just said, shoot, if Beijing could reinvent itself and China could do different places, around the country, I'm not going to get into anything other than talking about that from a revitalization perspective. Back to Spencer, I said, this is just a small town. It's 1 square mile. It's got depressed properties around the courthouse. And if we can start the ball rolling, in 5 years, it'll look different. And in 5 more years, it'll look different again. And when I think about the pictures of the downtown area when we started 10 years ago and how everything was vacant or boarded up or in disrepair and underutilized, and think about, that journey and where we are now versus then, this is a long journey. If you can be part of that community evolution, then you get a chance to see and enjoy it, in ways that you can't even imagine. There's no column on the spreadsheet. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I have some questions. I really think this has been great, and I love the fact that you both have worked so hard to preserve the charm of our communities, and these are the things that make, the Indiana Uplands so special. So we do have some questions. So the first one I'm going to ask both of you. We were asked, do you see large nationwide private equity-backed investment firms getting interested in buying small town rentals and housing in Indiana? And is the competition for those competition for properties with these investors becoming an issue for small and local developers? Are you seeing interest from outside in the communities that you're working in?
I think overall, a lot of smaller communities, yes, are dealing with absentee owners where you can essentially get online and buy a bulk of properties, which I don't think is helpful for anybody. Having local control is, I think, how you control the destiny of your communities. And that's just something I see working in different communities throughout Indiana. I don't have any direct experience with that, but it is a problem that I see pop up in the communities we work in.
Mike, are you seeing that in Spencer?
Yes, but it's still early. So, and I realize that our proximity to Bloomington is a blessing and a curse. In that we have the ability to be viewed as a bedroom community, but a lot of the economic activity centers around Bloomington and the near suburbs of Bloomington in Monroe County. So the interest level is starting to change, but we haven't seen the investment shift yet. It will come.
Okay. Mike, could you talk about what resources you tap to learn about how to navigate buying, rehabbing, and renting out your properties? If this isn't your main profession, and from your bio it was not, it seems like a heavy lift. So who or what did you rely on to guide you?
The internet, Menards, community. Luckily for me, I've always had an interest in architecture and construction. In my early life, I was lucky enough to work at Marriott in their architecture and construction division. I did business consulting for them, trying to figure out how to build hotels and hotels more efficiently. And so that broader level of project understanding, and then being a consultant, I've involved in projects. You have to start something, you have to design it, you have to build it, and then you have to turn it over. So that whole construct has been through me, and with me throughout my career. So when I went and looked on the internet and looked on at different resources for getting involved with housing, I let those, combination of real life experiences and being willing to just go out and do a bunch of research, and including going and talking to some different builders and some different developers and asking them, what do they do, walking through their houses and that were under construction, and being willing to be a sponge. If they would allow me to, I would, tell them what I'm doing. And if they said they weren't interested, then I would say, okay, let's go to your house. That's kind of, how I started this process. Luckily, one of the good things, and maybe unluckily for some of the panelists, in Indiana, there, it's one of the few states that in rural communities you don't need to have a general contractor license in order to build stuff. You still have to follow planning and zoning and all kinds of other guidelines, but it gives you a lot of flexibility to start with a little bit less painful lift. But I did this, as I mentioned, it was a very, very stepwise thing where I did some smaller renovations, and that got me comfortable with doing one thing, which got me comfortable with considering another thing. And I use this phrase for people who know me. I used it throughout my career: crawl, walk, run. And I applied that as I started to think about building this first house. I didn't build 3 of them at the same time. I built the first one first, and I let myself learn. I let myself.
Uh-oh. Well, while we try to get Mike back, Julie, I'm going to ask you the next question. Does a property in an opportunity zone aid in the ability to attract investment in housing projects?
Yeah, I think it certainly does. Oh, Mike, you want to finish up?
Sorry. I'm done.
Okay. All right. We're asking Julie about opportunity zones.
Yeah, I think it certainly attracts positive investment opportunities for folks. I think it depends on if it's market rate or the structure of the affordable housing you're working on. As much as you might think that all money is great, sometimes funding sources don't play well together. So it's really just a function of what you're trying to do. But generally, yeah, opportunity zones aid in attracting investment.
Mike, can you talk a little bit about the cost of your single family housing that's for sale? And we've had some inquiries about the price points of it. And also, are your rental units fully occupied?
So I shared a little bit in the, while we've been talking with respect to the houses. The houses that I have are 3-bedroom, 2.5 bathroom, 1,800 square feet. You can see kind of a compact footprint and 9-foot ceilings. I did a lot of, you saw the pictures, kind of upgrade them as much as I could. And the price point now, the house that I just just sold and due to close at the beginning of October, which is the picture of the house I showed you on East Jefferson Street. We listed that for $215,000. The first house that we sold was $195,000. So, you know, that allowed me to set that benchmark that I mentioned earlier with respect to having an appraisal value that would make it worth my while. You make a lot of money on the first house, but it made it worth my while to say, now I can create a stepping stone for the next house and the next house. And that's what I did. I stepped up the price with each successive house. And now I'm probably at about a 15% return for the new houses. And I'm fine with that. If I can make more money, well, I'd be fine with that. But like I said, I'm kind of going through this journey of trying to prove it out for other builders and letting them invest in it so that we could have more housing choices in the Spencer area. And so to me, that's the residential housing piece. With respect to the rentals, they're all fully rented. You know, I rent 1-bedrooms for about $750 a month and 2 bedrooms for $850 a month. And that's without electricity. If I add electricity in different properties, I have different configurations because I have to share utilities. And so when I manage that, you know, it could be between $700 and $800 for the rentals for 1-bedrooms. And a little bit more for 2s. And as I said, everything is occupied. I tell people I could build 100 apartments in Spencer and they'd be full within 6 months. And that's what I used to tell them as part of Spencer Main Street based on all the economic variables that were at play. And then when ROI did its regional housing initiative study and said, hey, Owen County has a 500 home deficit growing to 800 homes. That's where I think you get the credibility, because when I was talking to developers before, even trying to get them to be interested in doing 25 and 50 unit types of projects, they say, well, the economics don't bear it out. There isn't enough marketing, data to substantiate the investment, especially when you're dealing with out of town investors or developers. And so the ROI information has been a really invaluable tool to have available for the community to kind of look at a place like Spencer or Owen County, and obviously throughout the Uplands area, where you have these wonderful pocket opportunities, and hopefully we'll start to see that type of project activity escalate as we get through COVID and kind of move forward. But even with respect to that, as everybody knows, housing has stayed one of the strong points for us. We've been very, very fortunate.
Well, we're really glad that you were able to utilize this data in the housing study. This was a question that you answered in the chat, but I wanted to have a little chat about it. Neither one of you, we had a question about whether or not you have had to work in projects where there was no access to sewer or that kind of infrastructure, and both of you have said no. As one of the benefits, I think, of working in infill is that it typically has those kinds of amenities to it. But Julie, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and Mike also, that you faced when you were doing historic rehab, because that is complicated. And we had a question about the challenges and obstacles that you encountered while remodeling historic properties and how you dealt with them.
Yeah. Well, you never know what you're going to get until you start on construction. So while I haven't worked on a project that didn't have sewer service, I mean, we've been in the situation where we have to completely replace lines because they're so old and decrepit. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is continuing to remind yourself that you just have to roll with it, because there's in infill, even if it's new construction, you never know what you're going to get when you start digging around on that site. Even if you get geotech done and do everything you're supposed to do before you start construction, you still get surprises. And then in rehab, you can open up a wall and find, I don't know, horrible things or great things, but either way, you have to keep working together. And so whether you're a solo developer like like Mike or at a Flaherty and Collins in the world, I think it goes back to having the right team or the right resources and good communication in place to overcome the challenges that you encounter, because they are going to pop up.
Mike?
Well, I was echoing on what Julie said, is that when you peel the onions layers, you don't know what you're going to get underneath the next layer with a 100-year-old building, and that's the part of the having a deep breath, having a partner, whatever the partner is, somebody that you're working with on the construction side of it, to say, okay, that's not what I expected. I did not expect 3 layers of flooring on this, second story section that was, causing all of the sagging of the first floor ceiling. That basically meant that we weren't going to be able to start construction until we addressed that problem, which meant going down and shoring up the foundation, and, jacking up, structural supports, and just not being intimidated by that. And again, as a small fry, listening to the people who know, who have done it before, and reaching out and applying that very, very humbling aspect of asking questions so that you can learn. And sometimes the answers, excuse the French, sometimes the answers suck. I didn't expect to have to jump, $20,000 into this part of the renovation. There goes my fill in the blank budget, right? And that's that's the hard part about doing this is that you've got to be able to, bear through it and say, okay, well, what are the different ways that we can solve the problem? And how can we apply some, smart things and do it in a way that doesn't create, overwhelming hardship. And luckily, even for me, when I bought those 5 buildings on Market Street, I went to the town inspector before I bought them, and he was willing to walk through the buildings with me, and we talked about it. So where do you see the potential problems here, and where are things worth saving and not saving? And that goes back to what I mentioned before with that 2-story section where we decided that it was way too far beyond the expense to manage the maintenance of the existing brick facade. As much as it pains me to have made that decision, pragmatically, I couldn't have spent $100,000 brick facade on a building that I paid $100,000 for. The economics just wouldn't have worked, and I created an alternative solution. And I think that's part of the comfort level, is you got to be willing to have a lot of flexibility and still try to hold true to what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, well, we had one attendee who called you a godsend, Mike. But a more practical question is, how do other communities find their community's Mike? How do we find the small developer that's living inside somebody in their community?
They're already there. I'll say they don't have to come from outside. I did, but I've met those people already, and they're part of the community. And I think that community engagement piece, in whatever those conduits are, I mentioned Spencer Main Street. There are other economic meetings, whether it's through the Chamber of Commerce or other things like that. The economic, the county economic development organizations. Those community and government, quasi-government entities are already there, and it's allowing for the discussions to take root. And sometimes it may require somebody to figure out what kind of leaning in and leaning forward is going to happen from a county economic development perspective for providing some funding if this kind of development activity happens. The same thing in a town. If this development activity happens, we can assure you that there will be an outcome, and you don't have to worry about if I'm going to go buy, an old house, in town, am I going to be able to rezone it the way that I was able to rezone it in Spencer? And so, like I said, I think that lots of those, maybe to scare my wife and my children, lots of Mike Sudols are out there. It's just starting the process with the engagement from and within the community to bring them up. And I'll talk to anybody. And I say that you've got my email information. I've got 24 hours in a day. I don't mind talking to anybody if I get them interested in making Indiana a better place. So it's a joy to be here and be part of this process.
Well, I have had the benefit of seeing before and afters in person of both your work. So on behalf of Indiana and our communities, thank you, because you've made a significant difference in the places that you've chosen to do projects. I want to thank you greatly for participating in the session today. It was really interesting. And if you are interested in hearing more sessions like this one, please go online and register for the next 4 sessions. And if you missed the first session or didn't get the opportunity to see all of today's session, they are recorded and they will be placed on our website. So thank you again for Mike and Julie for your time and your expertise. It was greatly appreciated, and thanks to all of you out there who chose to join us today, and we will hopefully see you next week. So thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thanks.